So I'd like to welcome everybody to the first CERC seminar of the semester, well attended. I see that the semester is starting out well here. I'm sorry the room is small, but when we try to get a seminar together at short notice, we have to do with the rooms that are available. This is a big university in a relatively contained location. So welcome everybody. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to announce an upcoming CERC seminar next month on October 23rd in Y5109, same time. The talk is by Dr. Bryce Beamer, not the car person, Bryce Beamer. No one laughed. He told me that would be funny. But, sorry, blame the victim. Right? How do we compare global slaveries, war captives, and cultural exchange in Southeast Asia? A fascinating topic. But today we're very pleased to have Michael Vatikiotis with us. For those of you who are interested and know about Southeast Asian studies, somebody you would have long heard about. His background, his studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and took his doctorate at the University of Oxford. He's a member of the Asia Society's International Council and has a decade of experience working as a private diplomat and conflict mediator for the Geneva-based Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. He's a former BBC journalist who's worked in Asia for over 30 years, living in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Hong Kong. He now lives in Singapore and is the author of two well-known books on the politics of Southeast Asia. He'll be talking to us about his newest book. Michael, welcome to CityU, welcome to CERC. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. Forgive me if I drift every now and again. I got off a plane at I got on a plane at 6:45 this morning in Singapore, but at least I'm here in spirit, if not in body. I very much appreciate SIAC for arranging this at short notice. Thank you very much. I have just finished writing a book, which was just recently published. It's called Blood and Silk, and the title of my talk is really about the book. I'll explain more about the book as I go on. It's a distillation, essentially, of almost 4 decades of experience as a student, then a journalist, and more recently as a mediator and private diplomat. For most of this time, almost 40 years, I've been trying to understand the dynamics of power as they affect society. The book is divided into themes, which I argue are relevant to understanding the dynamics of power. The historical development of society and the role of the monarchy, for example, two of those themes. I trace the modern political development of the region from the so-called third wave of democratization that swept the world in the 1970s and which hit Southeast Asia with full force by the mid-1980s. A major part of my argument is how minimal the impact of decades of reform and democratization has ultimately been on the political landscape, which is still dominated by authoritarian or semi-authoritarian systems, only partly free, to quote Freedom House. This is where, if we look at what is going on in Southeast Asia today, the book, I'm sorry to say, can be regarded as timely. Because across Southeast Asia, in my view, democracy is in peril. Myanmar's democratic transition is faltering. Thailand is enduring a 4th year of military rule. Cambodia, just in the news, has launched an aggressive campaign against the opposition and threatens to wage war if the ruling Cambodian People's Party loses elections in 2018. Malaysia's angry electorate is unlikely to be able to vote out of power the ruling party that has governed the country since independence. Whilst in the Philippines, the number of people killed without due process this past year has already exceeded the total number of people killed by Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator in the 1970s and 80s. So, and even in Indonesia, where democracy seems secure, there are indications that popular demands for equality and security are starting to outweigh respect for one man, one vote. So, to underpin this argument, I point to several factors that render Southeast Asia prone to what I call a democracy deficit. One, an arcane culture of power that sustains a privileged elite and stacks the odds against effective implementation of popular sovereignty. 2, impunity, enduring impunity and a lack of accountability that sustains high levels of stress and conflict in society. 3, unresolved violent conflict, usually on the margins, that poses challenges for representative civilian government and empowers the security forces. And 4th, chronic levels of corruption that makes elites defensive and prevents smooth or regular transfers of power. Add to this alarmingly high levels of economic inequality, which is further dividing societies, and more recent pressure on pluralism stemming from the rise of identity politics fueled by global trends towards religious orthodoxy and extremism. To give some concrete examples, Myanmar, where a democratic election in 2015 saw the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, come to power in a wave of optimism. Yet the 2008 constitution, it should be remembered, makes it impossible for the military to be displaced. Myanmar also has the longest running civil wars in the world, and it forces the government to divert its energies towards disentangling autonomous local warlords from army interests on the periphery. And there's a vicious clash, of course, between Buddhists and Muslims on the western border, which threatens to derail everything. Thailand, just to give a few headlines again, the army has intervened twice in the past decade to prevent a popularly elected government from diluting the power of a conservative establishment that feeds off royally dispensed patronage. Cambodia, Southeast Asia's longest-serving Prime Minister, Hun Sen, rules like a king and refuses to consider the possibility of losing at the ballot box. After recent local elections showed his ruling Cambodian People's Party heading for a likely defeat in general elections next year, he's warned of war if the opposition wins. And as you've seen from the news, he's arrested the opposition leader on charges of treason and chose to do that on the day that he shut down an English language newspaper. So he's obviously grabbing the headlines, or wants to. Malaysia, where the biggest corruption scandal this region has ever known, prevents the Prime Minister from allowing a normal parliamentary democracy and free press to function. Despite allegations that the Prime Minister siphoned close to $1 billion of public money into his personal bank account, he's likely to be re-elected. And finally, Indonesia, where a popularly elected president could not defend his political ally, the Christian and Chinese governor of Jakarta, from a mob of Islamic hardliners, where people are even starting to question whether or not a non-Muslim should be elected to any kind of electoral office. So these are the sort of examples that they're quite unfortunately up to date, but there are many more examples in the book of this kind of demi-democracy, as I call it. The book also considers the two main geopolitical trends buffeting Southeast Asia. First, the impact of an enduring sectarian struggle between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shiite Iran that first transmitted rebellious impulses across the world in the wake of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which then set up a reactionary Sunni counterwave that dispersed the seeds of deeply conservative Salafi Wahhabi teaching, and therefore created a fertile environment for Islamic extremism. Let me explain in a little more detail. My own experience of this in the 1980s in Indonesia was that the original sort of impulse for freedom on campuses and student activism actually was after the mid-1970s, where there'd been the sort of impact of the third wave of democratization. There was another wave of this in the early 1980s, which was inspired by the Iranian Revolution. And I had mingled with a lot of the students at the time, and they were, they were quite convinced that this was the new impetus for liberalization, if you like, or liberation, which was the Iranian Revolution. And the Saudis clearly saw this as a threat, and it was about this sort of early to mid-1980s that the first Wahhabi teachers and Salafist teachers came to Indonesia and set up schools, and they very, very quickly took hold. They had a very there was a lot of money, and there was a lot of mosque building, there was a lot of infrastructure of Islamic teaching, and a lot of the teachers were supplied or trained in Saudi Arabia. And so by the late 1980s, all this inspiration from the Iranian Revolution had been replaced by a much more conservative impulse of Sunni orthodoxy. The second geopolitical trend, which I think is, of course, very relevant to the region today, to Southeast Asia today, and indeed to Hong Kong itself, is the rise of China and the fallout from increasing competition for strategic primacy in Asia. This threatens to end more than half a century of interstate harmony in Southeast Asia. Because rising tensions in the South China Sea over China's claims of sovereignty have divided ASEAN, and whilst US warships conducting freedom of navigation operations increase the risk of incidents that could spark a war, there's also the fact that within ASEAN itself, China is increasingly trying to reinforce what it calls strategic relationships and increasing levels of military training. So it's not just about building infrastructure and trade, people-to-people contacts, as they like to say. There's also an incipient security architecture that's being established as well. China is increasingly asking its neighbors in Southeast Asia to reject its alignment with the West as it draws the region into its economic and I would argue security orbit. Towards the end of the book, I consider the future of Southeast Asia. But despite the gloomy perspectives that I've elaborated on, that occupy the majority of the book, I'm reasonably confident all the same that the region will continue to prosper, its people will achieve significant levels of wealth and security, but there will be costs. There will be, I think, a deepening democracy deficit. Thailand is set to endure bridled economic landscape for the next 2 decades. In the Philippines, President Duterte's plan for federalism, if it passes, will empower his family and clique together with their own violent brand of strongman rule. Cambodia looks set to abolish multi-party electoral democracy entirely, and in Myanmar, the army could step back into full power. Secondly, sectarian and ethnic strife will intensify as political actors increasingly exploit the divisive effects of race and religion to shore up their power. This in turn makes for less social stability and a heavy security infringement on freedoms. People will accept trade-offs between their security and democratic space, but at the same time, there will be an uptick in irredentism that could see the dilution of sovereignty in the establishment of more autonomous areas. And lastly, China will dominate the geopolitical domain. There will be less tolerance of the region's traditional balancing of powers impulse, less economic and financial autonomy, and the threat of China's particular form of extraterritoriality with regard to the overseas Chinese. Fortunately, both access to technology and a sufficient degree of what I call demi-democracy will enable civil society to address, to a degree, the need for some capacity to represent people and push back on the state. This is what I like to characterize democracy you can eat. It bypasses the political parties that have failed to deliver to communities at the grassroots. It ignores increasingly onerous security restrictions and asserts popular will. In conclusion, Southeast Asia by 2050 may well start to look a little bit more like the region did before it was colonized by the European powers. A collection of smaller, confederated states with considerably looser affiliations with centralized metropolitan centers. Many of these, of course, given the current rate of climate change, may well be underwater. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sometimes we have speakers that go over time. I think you have the record, Michael, for the shortest seminar ever.
A session, a discussion.
Yeah, there's plenty.
Because there's a rich amount of material in this book, and I can't really all capture it in 5 minutes.
Right, well that's our job then. Yeah.
Mike, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your arcane culture of power.
Yes. Well, I wrote a book in the mid-1990s that started sort of talking about what I felt was the reinforcement and strengthening of the traditional methods of wielding power, which had come down through the region through the sort of the Hindu or Buddhist notion of kingship. And these were quite modern leaders, but nonetheless, I think it's Tony Reid who first mentioned the idea of there was a postmodernist. There was a modernist period in Southeast Asia that immediately followed the colonial period, where a lot of the leaders and elites who took over the newly independent countries were schooled in the West, or had Dutch liberal education, or an English liberal education, or a French liberal education, and the way in which they conceived of and the foundational principles of their countries were sort of very similar to these sort of ideals. But by about the 1980s, that generation had begun to disappear. And it was replaced by, if you take, for instance, Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, he never had the opportunity of that kind of education. And he was not particularly enamored with those ideals. His father had been a follower of Subhas Chandra Bose, supported the Axis powers. He was rather resentful of the sort of the Western colonial influence. And almost, I would argue, subliminally, started to absorb sort of more traditional ways and manners of wielding power. And Suharto was another example. I mean, he was never really, he was briefly he was in a native school, and then he actually was briefly in the Japanese militia at the end of the Second World War. And he was not at all, imbued of any of these sort of ideals. And his notions of wielding power were purely traditional. And so one can go on. So I started to look at that in more detail, and then that led me to examine, what is that culture of power? And you have first of all, obviously, the Hinduistic notions, which are very hierarchical, caste-driven, but you also have at the same time the Buddhist notions of Deva Raja, where you have the good king, the god king, the king who's supposed to look after and make sure that everything is well under the cosmos. And there's sort of the tension between those two sort of different ruling traits, which to some extent came together very, very nicely and purely in a modern form with Bhumibol in Thailand. Now, if one really wants to focus on how does that come through today, Hun Sen is a very good example. As far as he's concerned, multi-party democracy is a privilege. It's not a right. He's the one who prefers it as the ideal ruler. I think a lot of this is quite subliminal. I don't think these people necessarily, come to have a sort of conscious realization that that's what they want to copy or emulate. But I think it comes with the passing of that immediate modernist period in Southeast Asia and this long sort of postmodernist period where because societies themselves haven't transformed themselves that much, it's obvious that the rulers are going to adapt to those societies. That's a very inadequate tracing.
Michael, you mentioned these sort of structural factors besides what we were just talking about, the power, conception of power, the impunity, the violent conflicts, and so on. But the interesting thing, of course, is of the countries you mentioned, the change for the worse has been relatively recent.
Yes.
And you think about Malaysia with the Abdullah Badawi after Mahathir, that seemed like a period of relative liberalization, and yet now, just over 10 years later, things are the way they are. Cambodia also seemed to be looking up somewhat, and then the last two elections seemed to have pushed it back. Thailand, probably, of course, back to 2006, but of course, even in during the Yingluck period, there was some optimism until she was overthrown. And the Philippines, people thought Aquino was doing relatively well. So I'm wondering if you want to maybe talk about some more sort of short-term factors. And the second question is, you didn't talk about Singapore. I mean, isn't that a country that maybe actually, given perhaps some of the problems that we didn't see, which I can now say, I think, if their own family's talking about it, that the problems the ruling family, the Lee family is having, that there's some prospect for liberalization there?
Yeah, I talk about Singapore in the book. I mean, I also make the point that Singapore is to some extent a great anomaly because it's essentially a city-state. And, it doesn't really have a traditional society. It has you could say kindly, is a sort of coolie society. Parts of Malaysia look very much like Singapore. But, it's interesting, in the case of Singapore in the last decade, things actually started to slightly open up. The the sort of the decline of Lee Kuan Yew and his eventual death, and the demands made by people, you know, in the community of the government that to some extent took the government by surprise. I mean, there they were sort of bringing all these people in, try and keep the economy afloat, and all of a sudden Singaporeans say, no, we don't want these people. You know, we actually want to do things ourselves, and you know, they're taking rice out of our bowl. And that came as a little bit of a surprise because that meant they had to adjust policy, and they were to some extent. You know, that was an issue at the ballot box, and then they were, to everyone's surprise, and it was at the 2008 election. You know, people were elected in opposition parties, whereas we got grown accustomed to the fact that they simply weren't. And one of the interesting things about, I think, Singapore today is that, yes, the government until now has been very, very adept at adapting to these demands, so that there's no real kind of, the pressure doesn't get out of hand. I think social media is beyond them, as it is in many countries in this region. You try and ban Facebook. You know, Thailand almost did it. You know, it would have been a really difficult thing to you know, for people to accept. And I think similarly in Singapore, yes, there are legal safeguards in place, but this whole Lee Kuan Yew dynasty thing is played out on Facebook. You know, the Straits Times is telling me that they're still called up and told not to print stories that are appearing on Facebook. And then you have the whole Weibo, Alibaba platforms coming in that are going to be more difficult to control. So Singapore had started to go in a way against the grain of the rest of the region. You know, when the demands of what they call the homeland, the ordinary Singaporeans had started to weigh in on the government and forced them to sort of adapt. But obviously, by no stretch of the imagination is Singapore a functioning democracy, as we would like to call it. I mean, they are great proponents in Singapore of this argument of economic rights and sufficiency and keeping people happy that way. But the fact is that people are no longer so happy. And you know, I was in Malaysia yesterday and the day before, and Malaysian Chinese politicians were telling me that actually in Malaysia, where they have a lot of problems with their political system, the middle class is actually happier than they are in Singapore. I mean, Singapore's got quite a few problems. You know, the economy is not doing well. There is this immigration issue. There are concerns about savings. Whereas in Malaysia, you know, actually, and the Prime Minister says this, you know, the figures speak for themselves, people are actually doing quite well. And that's one of the fact that the middle class is doing well in Malaysia is one of the impediments on the sort of the democratic struggle. So it's sort of, if you sort of really look at it in a fine-grained way, I think Singapore continues to be an anomaly, but you know, there are issues that the government is increasingly finding it challenging to deal with. And although the opposition did less well in the last general election than they did in the previous one, the door has certainly been open to that. And my own personal view is that Lee Hsien Loong is clearly not his father, is not as powerful or charismatic a figure, and there are succession issues that lie ahead, and everyone has decided that, yes, you know, it's going to be difficult to appoint a non-Chinese prime minister, but there are popular figures out there who are not Chinese. So there are tensions, but they are well managed.
You mentioned that China divided Southeast Asia with its position in the South China Sea. Is it still realistic to believe that the U.S. can provide a balancing power, or is fake? No, we are now, China is with the Belt and Road, and is it just a question now of how much we can take advantage of China? But all of us somehow will be under the sway of China.
Yeah, this is the kind of the big question of the current era, not just because of China, but also because of Trump. So, you know, people are asking these questions and saying, are we, you know, Singapore, to take a good example, the foreign policy establishment clings to the notion that this is a temporary blip. You know, the US will come to its senses, They will do everything in their power to reestablish, reassert their strategic saliency in the Asia Pacific. Trump is an aberration, yes, but there will be, the restoration will come. That is the optimistic view. My view is rather more pessimistic. I think that it's not so much about politics and policy, it's also about fundamentals of capital and budget. The US finds it extraordinarily difficult to maintain its military posture in the region in terms of costs. Europeans, who have some of the most valuable trading relationships in this part of the world, they don't have foreign policy, they don't have defense expenditure. And so the West, to balance China, is looking rather thin, in terms of budgetary capacity. And over time, it could get worse. One of the points that's been made about the US Navy and its troubles in the Pacific over the last few weeks is that they simply don't have, the budget to
paint their ships, even rusting.
Right. So I think, and China, for the time being, clearly has. They've got more, bullets and more dollars. So I think that's one of the things in the background. But more immediately, there's the question of policy, and it's clear that under Xi Jinping, the gloves have come off, and China wants to assert its great power status in a much less peaceful way. I'm exaggerating because I think the foreign policy establishment in China is still looking for ways to adapt what they would regard as, the 5 principles of non-interference, and how to sort of adapt this to the fact that they clearly are going to have to be a little bit more interventionist in the region. And I think the best example of that is Myanmar today, where China is heavily intervening in the peace process, has a huge situation along its border. It's relying on infrastructure running through Myanmar to reach Yunnan, to connect Yunnan with the sea. This is a very important, for China, this is a very important sort of new form of external policy. There's also, of course, a lot going on between China and Africa and China and the Middle East to some extent, and One Belt and Road extends into Europe. But Southeast Asia is the marches, if you like, to use an old term, of China, the rising power, and therefore, they're very active. People go back and forth on whether the South China Sea claims of sovereignty is really about geopolitics or about reinforcing Communist Party rule at home. There's some interesting theories about how, because there are no other sovereignty disputes that China can use to whip up nationalism, that the 9-9 line becomes a very convenient way of doing that. It's interesting to note that the Indian-China border dispute was just resolved. I mean, not resolved, but shelved very conveniently by a phased withdrawal. No such thing in the South China Sea. So it's clear that remains, and I know this because we work on the issue, that it remains the most sensitive security issue for China, and it's one of the most important priorities for its overall policy in the region. So I tend to fall on the side of believing that actually we cannot expect the West to come back in the form that it was before. I just don't see it happening. And we have better get used to the fact that China will be the dominant geopolitical power.
Yes. Well, thank you for a very interesting, condensed, and precise talk. I actually have comments and questions. From a critical political economic perspective, I totally share your pessimistic view on the developments in Southeast Asia.
But as a human being,
but by which, from a critical political economy, by which I mean, the political elites and the business elites are in a collusion, and because of this collusion, that prevents any meaningful reforms to take place. So I totally share your view that and any reforms will be rather meaningless. But also note that towards the end, you mentioned there was some sort of mitigation factor, and that is the access to technology and the rise in civil society.
Yes.
I think that is a very interesting point because from my own research in Myanmar, I suddenly noticed that from 2010 onwards, there was a sharp increase in the number of civil societies. Now, but my concern is that those civil societies are mainly backed by, such as George Soros Open Society
Yes.
and NED.
Yes.
So obviously, it's got this appearance of another color revolution being prepared, or at least being
Yes.
keep under the sleeves. So my question is, how do you see this civil society as a mitigation factor, given that they also have their own agenda? Now, also my second question is on your book title, which is Blood and Silk, and then you say power and conflict in modern Southeast Asia. What do you mean by modern? Because if we see that this political embedded structure has always been within some society, then what do you mean by modern?
Well, answer that question first. I mean, it's a convenient device for me because the book is rather personal and therefore covers really my experience in Southeast Asia, which spans 1979 to the present day. So that's an easy answer. I'm defining my experience, my time horizon, which is a convenient one too, because it's actually been a very interesting period. But I would agree with you that you could look at it another way and say, well, actually, how do you define modern? I mean, we just talked about the arcane models of culture and power, and I'm arguing at the end of the book that Southeast Asia is coming a little bit of a full circle and going back to some of the structures of the pre-colonial period, both in space and in socio-cultural terms. So, yes, I mean, if I was strictly speaking looking at this academically, I would have to define that. Since I'm not, I will simply say, well, it's the period that I've been in Southeast Asia, which has been very interesting, and I try to sort of capture the trends. To answer your first question, whenever you, it struck me now a few times since I finished this book, I end on a note that is actually quite interesting in itself, and requires, in other words, further development. It could have been part of the book, it could have been put somewhere else, and it really struck me towards the end that actually, your point is absolutely right. Everyone is saying that the politicians will simply not be improving anytime soon. The political actors, are moving in the direction they are. Political systems are moving in the direction that they are, and the only hope really is civil society. You hear that a lot from the various protest movements or the resistance that's now building up in society towards this sclerotic sort of demi-democracy. That civil society is the hope. But then, as you correctly point out, there are two ways of looking at it. There are those. I mean, Cambodia is fearful of the color revolution. I mean, they've just kicked out NDI. Cambodia was sort of ground zero for NGOs, especially Western NGOs, in the last few years, and they've literally just started cracking down on visas. No one's going to be able to stay. They're going to scrutinize. In Myanmar, it's the same thing. Everyone's now suddenly having to have an MOU. So the government is now realizing that actually we've allowed this to go a little bit too far. But there is also the ugly side of civil society, which is those aspects of civil society that are being supported by reactionary forces, like we see Mabata in Myanmar, and there are examples in Thailand of civil society that is behind protest movements that on both the right and the left. And so, in many ways, it's beginning to replicate the divisions in society and being reflected through civil society. But what I specifically meant in the point that I made was that I see communities taking matters into their own hand a little bit more. So, far away from the centre, small local NGOs, not necessarily backed by political forces or international organisations, just self-help. People say, well, now we have access to the internet. We can set up a Facebook page. We can set up a crowdfunding, scheme. We can have a local media, TV, radio station cover us. All that stuff can be done, and I think that's probably the most optimistic thing that's happening. And I think technology is important because in this part of the world, the internet is almost free. and smartphones they penetrate to an incredible degree, even in places like Myanmar and Cambodia, and where incomes wouldn't otherwise suggest that. So that's the hope. I don't define civil society as being that backed by international organizations or backed by the reactionary forces. It's more the kind of organic, village-led or community-led movements. A good example in Thailand, which I mentioned in the book, is the way in which communities are pushing back on industrial estates. The government is selling land to Chinese companies to build these industrial estates. Communities are pushing back, and the government has been forced to retreat. And it's that kind of interaction that we're seeing citizen action almost effectively, not the kind of advocacy end of civil society, but the community-led. And that's why I think it would be a whole interesting area to go into, and would somehow balance the pessimism of the book.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for
Yeah,
the
sure.
presentation. Hi. Going back to the pessimistic strand, I have a question about the democratic deficit. And I guess I'll put the question simply and then explain why I'm interested in it. I'm wondering, in your travels in the region, do you feel it's become harder to shame the powerful into doing the right thing, or at least to be more restrained in the way they do the wrong thing, right? And I'm asking this because my sense is that, and I've not had a satisfactory answer from experts and scholars that I've asked, is that the kinds of downturns that we're witnessing in different countries seem to be creating, a sum that's greater than the whole that's greater than some of its parts. That there might actually be some kind of network effects going on. There might be some kind of mutual learning and spreading of bad practices, basically, that such that there's something in the current ideological climate or whatever, right, that makes each of these leaders, whether it's Najib or Duterte or even Lee Hsien Loong in Singapore, feel that, hey, it's actually okay to behave worse than we were behaving in the 90s. Because after all, bad behavior is the norm. It's hard to look worse than Putin or Erdogan, so we might as well do it. Do you feel in your own interactions in the region that we've come to that stage where it's actually harder to shame the powerful to do the right things?
I feel the answer is yes, and I'm wondering whether it's possible to capture a sort of relatively brief response to that. But I sense that you're right. Certainly in the Philippines, and a lot of that has to do with what people call the sort of the populist factor. Perhaps it's a product of the fact that leaders are now able to present themselves in a variety of guises and in different ways. Back in the 90s, it was basically mainstream media and newspaper op-eds and newspaper. Now you have a whole variety of media that can present a multi-dimensional aspect of a government and a leader. Chatti's been very good at that. You have also, I think, a dumbing down one of the greatest challenges the region faces has, I think, been the deterioration overall, not of access to education, but access to quality education. A sort of, this afflicts the world to some extent, but I think a sense in which people are willing to accept far less. They're not as questioning. They question other things, but I think they almost take for granted now that, as you were saying, put it very well, that people can behave a little bit worse than they did before. Standards are slipping, as they would say in the 19th century. And I find it sort of difficult to give a full explanation of that, but I sense that you're right, and that's part of the problem. Thailand is incredibly poorly governed by the military regime. It's not so much their fault because they're not equipped to govern. It's not their role, but they insist on being there, and so they sort of try to do the best they can, and they're not very good at it. The economy's not doing very well, and it's poor delivery of government services, and wheels are beginning to fall off a bit. But people don't seem to mind. they become conditioned to the view that, well, actually it was worse when the politicians were in charge, there was more corruption, the country was coming to a standstill, it was protests. And one of the striking things was this referendum for a constitution, which is, even the casual reader of the voluminous tome of this constitution would see that it's not nearly as good as the one it replaced or the one before that, or the two before that. And so it was only back in 1997 that there was a constitution that everyone was involved in having input to. There was a public consultative process, and it was by all accounts a wonderful constitution. And there was a connection between the people who drafted it, the people who had input to it, and the people who implemented it. And that's not the case anymore. So it's also partly because people are not being consulted. They're not, and they've managed to sort of persuade themselves that it's not so important to them anymore, which I find very odd. And I see that in the Philippines, I see that in Thailand, even in Malaysia, where, yes, I was talking to the leaders of the Bersih movement, which is one of the finest advocates of electoral reform in the region, and they're struggling with the middle class. They're struggling to get support. People just want to get on with their lives. And that leads into the other factor, which I think is we're increasingly going to see, Jerry, which is that people are more concerned about their personal security, especially with the rise of identity politics. People will make that trade-off. They'll say, well, I want a better leader, but actually I also want the police to protect me, and I'm willing to put up with that. It's a very good question.
So I'm an Australian exchange student, and I'm really interested in my country's foreign policy and attitude towards the ASEAN and Greater Asian region. I was wondering, it might be outside your area of expertise, but if you had an opinion on Australia's role in the ASEAN region and our capacity and appetite to engage and potentially play a leading role in the coming years.
Well, I do, because I work for an organisation that is funded partly by Australia, and I do interact with Australian Foreign Affairs and Trade Department on a regular basis and other policymakers. So I think Australia has struggled in recent years under conservative governments to connect with the region, or to see the relevance of connecting with Southeast Asia in particular. At the same time, there's a lively debate going on in Australia today about not just the relevance of the region to Australia in terms of trade and resources, but also whether Australia is increasingly being left alone, with the withdrawal of the US and the West in general, that it's just going to be Australia in the region. And so what's interesting is there will be next year a summit held in Australia, an ASEAN summit, an ASEAN-Australia summit, for the first time. They're bringing it to Sydney, I think. And what I begin to see, and I'm not sure if DFAT friends and colleagues would necessarily agree, but what I begin to see is a convergence almost of Australia's more immediate interests, geopolitical interests, and that of ASEAN. It's almost becoming a little bit like a Southeast Asian country in the way that it thinks. It's worried about extremism, it's worried about the Chinese, China, it's worried about what the Americans are going to do. Are they going to be there to protect us, help us, whatever? So all these interests have aligned in a way that I've not quite seen before. Australia's become less of a kind of Western country and more a kind of a Southeast Asian country, for a better word. And I think we're going to see more of that. Except that in Australia itself, society hasn't necessarily adapted to that. So, language classes in Southeast Asian languages have progressively been in decline. It's all been going the other way, which is a shame. And there's less and less interest, if you like, in society. But the country's national interests are more aligned than ever before.
So one recent trend, and for the foreseeable future, is I think secondary cities throughout the region are growing quicker, both economically and demographically. Mega cities are kind of creaking, more people, and so there's increased connectivity, production, and so this is quite different, I guess, if you go back centuries before the mandalas of power. but also over the past 2 decades where the megacities were the leading drivers. And so I was wondering how you foresee this to change both the power relations between center and periphery, and for example, lead to more decentralization.
Yeah, I mean, you're right for the most part, especially in island Southeast Asia, where Indonesia has a dozen or more cities of over 1 million, and the Philippines too, because of its island structure. It's less. I mean, you still have the remnants of the mandala are still strongest in mainland Southeast Asia for geographical reasons. Chiang Mai is still struggling to be the second city in Thailand. There's not much that goes on outside of Phnom Penh, and even though Naypyidaw sort of sets itself up as this massive new capital city, everything is in Yangon. And Mandalay is essentially a trading hub. So I think that if you look at the islands, though, I mean, it has been an impetus to decentralization and to be decentralization of politics. And Indonesia is increasingly seeing political leaders coming from those. The up-and-comers in Indonesian politics are the mayors of Bandung, Surabaya. Solo was elected as president. I mean, so you're seeing a trend of people from those secondary cities or secondary centers moving into the national frame. And there's less and less resistance, as it happens, to talk of moving the capital from Jakarta. Jakarta doesn't think the capital. It's a city that no one particularly wants to live in. Awful traffic. Overdeveloped, difficult to get around. People are quite happy to see the back of it. So I think we're going to see more of that impetus. I think the problem in Indonesia is there's still this neuralgia about proper decentralization. So, for instance, Surabaya really should be the center for the eastern part of Java, but no, the decentralization structure makes the districts more important than the provinces in terms of decentralization, because they're afraid of the concentration of power in those secondary or tertiary centers, leading to sort of impulses to separate. There's still that sort of subliminal sense that the republic isn't quite got the integrity that we hope, and that's why in the eastern part of Indonesia, there are ways of resolving some of the issues there by agglomeration. Then there's creating an eastern region. They're afraid of doing that. So I think the resistance is still, not empowering too much the secondary cities. In the Philippines, there's this agenda of federalism that the president was allegedly very serious about. And I was asking a couple of questions about this the other day. So how does he expect to get federalism through when his term is up in 4.5 years' time? And the answer to that, alarmingly and depressingly, was, well, he may be able to get the legislative framework done. And then once that is done, it will empower his clique and people like him, who will then, whoever gets elected as president, carry on that agenda, which I thought was an interesting formulation. It doesn't necessarily depend on Duterte. It depends on those who are supporting this federalism agenda, who are the kind of the big town mayors from outside of Manila who feel that their time has come. You're going to get more of that, in other words, and the kind of violent thuggery that their politics excels in, which he's brought to Manila. In mainland Southeast Asia, I think it's still going to be about challenging the center, because I follow very much the scholarship of James Scott in this regard. I think that his scholarship on the upland areas of mainland Southeast Asia and their sort of what he calls the state repelling behavior is still very, I think, germane in different ways and more diluted ways, across mainland Southeast Asia.
Slightly more personal question. Can you tell us a little about the role of private diplomats, particularly in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I work for an organization called the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a Swiss foundation based in Geneva that specializes in mediation and armed conflict and convenes, facilitates dialogue. That's sort of shorthand. It's a growing industry. We're not the only organization doing this. I mean, I think it sort of stemmed initially from the failure of the UN in the latter years of the Kofi Annan period to sort of really deal with conflict, and the failure of states. states became very willing to sort of then outsource mediation to private organizations. And there was been a bit of a heyday of that. I think the states are sort of coming back in. I mean, Syria is a very good example. The UN is trying to reassert itself as well. But in Southeast Asia, there is, I think, great, and also the same is true of China. Official meetings are not where you get the business done. I mean, official meetings are where people hold to official positions, and there's very little leeway and wiggle room, and essentially nothing gets done. Everyone comes, states official positions, nothing moves. And so it's in the informal spaces that you can actually generate ideas and maybe try to shift those positions. And increasingly, I'm finding that it's the creation of that informal space, whether it's a discrete dialogue between conflicting parties or whether it's working with governments on generating ideas for confidence building measures, they really appreciate it. Because you look at the code of conduct in South China Sea, it's gone nowhere for 20 years. Because everyone comes and sits there with a grim look of determined, people are determined to present their claims of sovereignty around the table. And that's never going to get resolved. That is what you need to be talking about is, well, what are the ideas that can be used to prevent conflict or to address, and manage conflict when it breaks out. That can't happen in those code of conduct discussions. So you need a kind of informal space. And that's, I think, where private diplomacy comes in. And it's particularly useful in the Asian context where official positions and adhering to those positions is very important. And there's none of that sort of cozy diplomacy anymore because people don't know each other.
Thank you for the great time talk. I would like to have your view on the implication of this democracy deficits to developments in Southeast Asia, not only GDP growth, but more inclusive economic growth. Because I found it very interesting that you suggested that in Indonesia, people's demand for equality and security is kind of opposite to one man, one vote. It sounds a bit odd to the neoliberal argument, but it fits perfectly in the dominant development ideology in China, which
yes.
China is exporting through One Belt One Road, one highway, and investment. So I wonder whether that's also one factor why people are putting up with the decreasing democracy, because there's a trade-off. Like in China, people think, well, actually the argument is that democracy is not good for economic growth. So I would like to.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent question to begin to ask in this region, in Southeast Asia as well. It hasn't been, I think, being put forth as an argument as such. I think it's essentially evolving because, I think primarily because of insecurity, and then secondarily because of inequality. Insecurity is driven by, movements to the city, Islamization, people taking refuge in identity, and politicians deciding that exploiting those divisions of identity are the best way to get elected. So democracy is part of the problem. And so in Indonesia it's very stark because, there are, people will say casually and from looking from the outside, but there are no Islamic parties, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is all the political parties are pushing the Islamic card because that's how they feel they're going to get elected. And that is increasing the divisions in society between moderates and if you like, secular and non-secular, but also Muslim and non-Muslim, and generating a great deal of insecurity. And then at the same time of generating that insecurity, people are looking for leaders who are to be able to protect them from this insecurity, and they'll be looking for sort of stronger leaders who are going to be asserting more control over these forces. So it's a sort of circular thing. But your point about economic security and equality, I mean, the Gini coefficients in most of these countries have gone up and down. There's been a more recent increase in the Gini coefficient in many countries, Thailand being a very stark one, but Indonesia, not just in terms of income inequality, but inequality in access to services and goods. I mean, the World Bank produced a very interesting report recently on food security in Indonesia. One of the worst situations of food security. I mean, basic staples, some basic staples in Indonesia are more expensive than they are in Singapore, which when you look at different levels of income is just appalling. And this is because of selfish politicians or selfish, bureaucrats and politicians who essentially want to impose high tariffs so they can make money. So it's this selfishness of people is helping this along. But we haven't yet got to the stage where people are saying, oh, look at, China seems to be doing quite well because they put their economic interests before their. I don't think we're not there yet in Southeast Asia. I mean, Indonesians, I think, not wishing to exaggerate my own argument, would still say that they're very proud of the fact they get to elect the president every 5 years, and the president only stays for 2 terms. It is a fundamental cohesive aspect of Indonesian society. There is a great deal of comfort with that system, and no argument and no preference for any other system. The problem is that representation is not being well served. It's the lack of institutions to support that basic direct democracy that is a problem. So people don't really care who represents them at the local level. The parliament does not function to necessarily protect their interests, or indeed to protect the ideals of the republic that would actually help counter the whole rise of identity politics. And so the weakness of institutions is not serving Indonesia's democracy very well. And so I would argue that you will eventually get to the point where people might say, yeah, well, actually, I would now prefer to have my economic interests looked after better, and I may not be so interested in whether I elect leaders or not. I mean, that's a possibility. And people are starting to worry about that. I was at a speech given by former President Yudhoyono yesterday, a day before yesterday, in Malaysia, where he actually stated quite strongly that democracy in Indonesia is now in danger. People are starting not to believe in democracy, he said. And so there is a concern about that.
Oh, thank you. I have a question for a long time. Maybe you can give me some suggestions. In terms of the way of ruling a country, you have mentioned Singapore. Singapore is ruled by a ruling family, while America is ruled by a president elected by their people every 4 years. But the 2 countries are both developed countries in the world, and America is the #1, maybe as we all know. And Singapore is also regarded as a model for many developing countries. So my question is, as long as the ruling class can rule the country very well and their people can benefit from it, shall we consider whoever rule the country? Thank you.
Well, I always fail to see why Singapore is considered a model for other countries, because Singapore is a city-state. So Singapore can be a great model for the Gulf states, or for other city-states, but it can't really be a model for a country, because it's an artificial construct in a way. If you look at modern-day Malaysia together with Singapore, you begin to see some of the dynamics of that kind of plural society that was a creation of the colonial period. And Singapore has been rather more successful in terms of integration than Malaysia. But again, it's a kind of, for me, it's kind of an artificial environment. However, on the power level, yes, I mean, it is run by a family, and there are now increasing strains, not just within the family, but within concerns about the future, because it doesn't seem to be that there's necessarily another Lee, who would be even remotely necessarily equipped to lead Singapore. The family is beginning to run out of options. So I think there's a great deal of concern. My own view would be, if I had to guess, is that eventually that will come to a head, and in the interests of maintaining stability, a compromise will be reached. But I'm not sure what that compromise will be. I'm sure that there are any number of mid-40 to early 50s brigadier generals in the Singapore Army who are seen as kind of relatively good bets for the future. That's often been talked about. I've met a couple of them. They're not quite clones of the Lee family, but they sort of almost get to, they could be substitutes. I think there's a great concern in the non-Chinese population about the lack of any possibility of there being a non-Chinese leader. But then we have to be reminded that Singapore is the only majority Chinese state outside of China and course that includes Hong Kong because Hong Kong is in China. So Singapore very much feels that these days. Singapore feels like it is the outlying Chinese state. Taiwan has its own particular history, but Singapore is very proud of its ability to be outside of the China frame. So that's also part of the calculus. I mean, there's been a recent debate in Singapore about how close or how independent or autonomous of Chinese policy and interests they can be. And that's related to the leadership issue as well, because a Chinese leader of Singapore becomes a big target for the Chinese in Beijing. You should be thinking like us. You should be more like us. Whereas a non-Chinese leader would be less susceptible to that, possibly. So that's also part of the calculus, I think.
Stefan. Stefan.
No, here.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I have a question. Earlier you said that in this region, the traditional society has not transformed that much. But then as a conflict mediator of the Center of Humanitarian Dialogue, well, you've also contributed to the calming down of the Aceh conflict. So my question is actually about the Rohingya issues in Rakhine. Would you say that's actually, the issue is going to be solved? Any possibility of a solution? And what's the role of the ASEAN countries?
It's an extremely good question and a very relevant one. The situation in Rakhine State, first of all, is extremely bad. We probably should prepare ourselves for the possibility that huge numbers of people have been killed by either the armed forces or by insurgency, or increasingly by insurgency. The early stages of any insurgency, terror is used by both sides. And I think terror has been used. There's large loss of life, and there's also huge levels of humanitarian suffering. And those reporters that have been able to get to the Bangladesh border have brought back pictures of long lines of people desperately fleeing. I mean, tens of thousands of people have left just since the 25th of August. As many as 40 or 50,000 people. That's a huge movement of people in response to a conflict. So the situation is dreadful. It's not just affecting Myanmar and Bangladesh, it's affecting the whole region. Southeast Asia is divided between two religions mainly. I mean, there's obviously huge numbers of Hindus and Christians, but there's also much larger numbers of Buddhists and Muslims, roughly half-half. And there's no doubt that there is anger building up in all the Muslim societies of Southeast Asia. The Indonesian foreign minister who's in Ecuador, Myanmar today, speaking of Aung San Suu Kyi, is under enormous pressure at home. I mean, they want Myanmar citizens expelled, they want the embassy shut down, they want to set fire to it. They tried to set fire to it yesterday. There is a mass protest that's going to assemble outside Borobudur Temple in central Java later this week. I mean, this has never happened before, where something that happens very, very far away. I mean, we saw in Europe with the sort of Danish cartoon thing. You saw a sort of global Muslim reaction. But here in Southeast Asia, people are not accustomed to this. I was writing an article yesterday. I was pointing out that we've had more than 15 years of a vicious conflict in southern Thailand that has killed more than 7,000 people. But the Malaysians across the border, and it's Muslims versus Buddhists in southern Thailand, they haven't been demonstrating in the streets about that. This Rohingya issue and Rakhine issue has set off enormously powerful emotions. And what's more, it's going to be exploited in all these countries. President Jokowi is under attack from Muslim hardliners. They will use this issue. So I think that there's similarly in Myanmar, the Buddhist nationalists are using this issue against the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. So it's the reverberations are more than just in Rakhine State. I think the region has never seen as serious a sectarian issue as this, affecting potentially, peace in the different countries. Where if I were a Myanmar citizen now in Indonesia, I would be quite worried if someone identified me in the street and said, "You're from Burma." It's happened in Malaysia in the last 2 or 3 years that Burmese citizens have been targeted. So it's having a regional impact. The solution is rather more difficult because the worst legacy of the colonial period for Burma is this issue of the division of the races, and there is simply no conversation about integration. They talk about their 135 different ethnicities or ethnic nations, of which the Rohingya are not one, so they simply don't belong. So there is simply no frame of discussion in which they belong in the country. And what's worse than that is that all the others, they remain different, but they can be in the country. So that they haven't even begun to have a conversation about integration, which is very serious.
Yes. Yes. It's about the Chinese population in Southeast Asia. I think we talk about, as you said, that China always talk to Singapore that, well, you don't think like me, okay?
Yeah.
So, do you think the rising of China will make the Chinese population become a sensitive issue again?
It has already.
It has already.
Agreed.
So it is very, very much influential because in the 1960s or 50s, right, it became a very big issue, right? Now after that, it died down for about 30 years, roughly. Now become another issue, isn't it?
I spent a lot of time on this in the book because I think it's one of the most interesting and understudied aspects of China's rise in the region. There have been various attempts at an official policy. Li Peng, I think, in the 1980s basically declared that all overseas Chinese, all Nanyang Chinese basically belong to the countries that you're in. That was a
nationality.
Yeah, that was basic sort of policy laid down by Li Peng. But since then, it has never been really restated. There are green cards available to so-called green cards, Chinese citizenship basically available to Chinese from Southeast Asia very easily. Many people have gone back. Many people come and go. In Indonesia, when there is anti-Chinese disturbances, people in Jakarta call up the Chinese embassy and ask for help. This kind of thing is going on. And that ambiguity is tolerated, if not promoted. The Indonesians have told me that in recent dispute discussions, territorial dispute discussions, or the return of, say, Chinese fishermen, caught in the Tuna Sea, the Chinese government will ask for Taiwanese citizens to be returned as well. People who are in Indonesian jail, by the way, return those Taiwanese too. So there's clearly an extraterritoriality. Increasingly, there is this kind of incipient extraterritoriality with regard to overseas Chinese, I would argue.
So there will be some tension because of the...
Yes, I think there will be. I mean, it may also, if you put yourself in the shoes of an overseas Chinese in Malaysia and Indonesia, actually, you could also be of some benefit too, right? I mean, you could find yourself afforded a bit of protection. If you're going to be suffering, at the hands of a Muslim mob or it could work both ways.
It could work both ways.
It could work both ways.
Thank you.
Kishore Mahbubani gave a talk at the Asia Society here in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, and it was striking how much more optimistic he was than you are. In part because he didn't seem to be quite as concerned about the state of democracy, but also because he thinks there's a remarkable regional story that many observers miss, and he calls it, as you've probably seen in his new book, the miracle of ASEAN. It's an organization that succeeded in putting a region that was on the brink of war in the mid-1960s, confrontasi, at the epicenter of the Cold War with the Vietnam conflict, to a place that, while there are these violent conflicts we've talked about, there are no major threats of war between the states of the region. Despite the political problems you've talked about, most of the countries of the region have done pretty well economically, at least if you look at it in terms of the last 50 years. So, how do you respond? Do you think, are you taking a completely different view than his, or is there some overlap between your views?
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that there's been 50 years of interstate peace in Southeast Asia. There's no question. That's been the single most important achievement of ASEAN. But the landscape of conflict is vast. Myanmar has the largest landscape of civil war in the world. 70 years. 1/3 of the country. Southern Thailand is the most deadly internal conflict in Southeast Asia. 7,500 and counting. Northern Ireland was 3,000. Southern Philippines is a mess, and it's drawing in more and more. These are not small conflicts. They may be on the margins, but they determine to a much greater degree than we often realize the security architecture. They affect political systems. They drive conflict economies. They fuel corruption. So yes, we've had 50 years of interstate peace. It's fine. It's great. It's wonderful. Thank God we haven't had that problem. But within these countries, I would argue, and that's why I'm very strongly arguing, look, these problems haven't even begun to be addressed, and they are dragging down the systems. So Kishore's book is wonderful in that respect because it points out, on the 50th anniversary year of ASEAN, what its achievement has been. But it's a lonely achievement.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I think part of the hope that you talked about is access to technological and online media. So I was wondering, because in the Philippines at least, this technological and online media has also become a venue for imposing Duterte's populist rule. And just recently, Duterte appointed one of the alleged popular figures of one of the alleged promoters of fake news in the Philippines. So I was wondering, how do you see, at least the online mainstream media, how do you see the media play fair in this what you call the period of power and conflict?
Yeah, it's a very
in the region.
It's a very challenging issue because it manifests itself in different ways, even within the Philippines. Like there are very, very many positive strands, and then there are very negative ones. I think that on the whole, we have to be thankful that that there are the Rapplers of this world, and that there are the Minder Newses of this world that actually do very good jobs of actually, piercing the propaganda. Indonesia is a country where, for instance, there's great fear of cyber armies now. I don't know if this is the same in the Philippines, but politicians who have the resources to manipulate social media with the numbers of people that you need to do that. You need a minimum of several hundred people to effectively, get your message out. And so there's been a counter-reaction, which is to look for media that will tell its subscribers we're not fake news, we're not a cyber army. Here's how we've checked this story. And I think Rappler's doing a relatively good job of that in the Philippines. There are in Mindanao certainly it's a very radio and social media very important ways of bringing people together. But when you look at the social weather station data, I think we should look beyond the sort of the 83% popularity rating a little bit. Maybe drill down into some of that data that shows that actually the people who like him the most are the people who benefit from him the most, which is still the rich, and the people who want to see the drugs off the street are the middle class, and the people who don't want their kids falling victim to it. The same was the case in Thailand. But the poor people are the victims, and they actually don't like the violence. So I think maybe the problem sometimes is that we don't disaggregate enough. We see a kind of a wall of media and a wall of polling data. The Philippines has been a rich history of that. I mean, it's one of the most polled countries in this region, in Southeast Asia. But I keep hearing that actually we should look a little closer. There are trends beginning to emerge that indicate that he's on a timeline too, like every other president in the Philippines.
Michael, it was perhaps the shortest presentation, but the longest discussion. So thanks so much for answering so many of our questions. Thanks again for coming.